Thank you all so much for joining us today. Before we get started, I do have a few things to read. This activity has been planned and implemented in accordance with the accreditation requirements and policies of the Accreditation Council for Continuing Medical Education through the joint providership of the Medical Education Council of Pensacola and the Mercer University School of Medicine. MECOP is accredited by the ACCME to provide continuing medical education for physicians. The Medical Education Council of Pensacola designates this live activity for a maximum of 5.5 AMA PRA Category 1 credits. In accordance with the policies of the ACCME, MECOP has collected disclosures from the speakers and planners and reviewers involved in this activity. None of the speakers, planners, or reviewers have any relevant relationships with ineligible companies to disclose. Dr. Gene Sumner has always cared deeply about the health of rural communities. A third-generation Georgia physician, Dr. Sumner has served in rural Georgia most of her career, practicing medicine in Washington and Johnson counties, before becoming dean in 2016. Dean Sumner came to Mercer University School of Medicine as a community faculty preceptor in 1989, became associate dean for rural health in 2014, and has held a succession of leadership positions over the years. She has served as hospital chief of staff and nursing home medical director, as well as a board member, chair, and president of numerous community and statewide professional organizations. At the state level, she served as a governor-appointed member, then president and medical director of the Georgia Composite Medical Board. In 2020, Dr. Sumner received the Ralph O. Claypool Senior Memorial Award from the American College of Physicians, the first Georgian to receive this prestigious award. She is also a fellow of the American College of Physicians. Dr. Sumner received a Bachelor of Science in Nursing and a Master of Science in Nursing from the Medical College of Georgia and completed her medical degree at Mercer University School of Medicine. She completed her internal medicine residency at the Medical Center of Central Georgia.
Good morning. I just want to welcome you to Mercer and to this conference. Tell you, we're very honored to be in alliance with Children's Healthcare of Atlanta and Marcus Autism for this effort. This is an important topic, and there are a lot of things that we need to solve, but you're the answer to solving those things, and we want to hear from you. We hope you leave here with a new enthusiasm to make the lives of our children better and to realize the numerous resources that are available, but also help us understand what we can do better and how we can help you. Mercer University School of Medicine is a private university, but we're funded by the state for our mission, and our mission is rural and underserved communities, or rural underserved communities. We take that mission very, very seriously. We're a little unique from most medical schools, and that we only accept Georgians, and we truthfully preferentially accept rural Georgians, because we believe getting physicians and health professionals to rural communities will help change our state for the better. The center receives a grant from the state to go out and to work with communities and bring resources and try to make the lives of rural Georgians better. And we work without stopping to find ways. We tell people when we show up, we won't leave unless you run us off. And we stay committed to that community. You're going to hear some experts today. I'm not one of them, but you'll hear some amazing people that know a lot about this topic. But you know a lot about this topic, so join in the discussion and contribute so we have a discussion that may lead to solutions in this state. Thank you so much for being here. We're glad to have you. We look forward to, I'm sorry I'm going to be in Savannah at one of our other campuses tomorrow, but y'all are coming over to the School of Medicine, so we're delighted to host you over there. That building was built when I was a student, so the good news is we're getting a new building, and it's going to be down on the river. So when you come down 75 and 16, you'll be able to see us. They haven't started building yet, but they have nice plans, and so we're going to move. So maybe in a few years, you'll come down to our new building downtown. thank you for being here. It's nice to have you, and I look forward to seeing you one-on-one. Thanks a lot.
Good morning, everyone. I will be introducing our first presenter for today. Dr. Nate Call is a professor of pediatrics and associate chief of the Division of Autism and Related Disorders in the Emory University School of Medicine. He has worked at Marcus Autism Center since 2006, where he has held many positions as a researcher, clinician, and leader of clinical programs. He currently serves as the Vice President of Children's Healthcare of Atlanta, responsible for the center. In this role, he oversees all clinical activities and works with providers and other center leaders to develop new clinical innovations. Dr. Call has an active research agenda and has published over 70 papers and book chapters on the treatment of harmful behavior exhibited by neurodiverse individuals. If we could all please give him a great welcome. Thank you.
Well, good morning. I'm excited to be here and excited to see this group. I'm told it's a pretty diverse crowd, that we've got folks from all different kinds of backgrounds, medical, folks who are working in other healthcare type settings, just a whole host of different parents, providers. And so diverse group, which I think is really fun and exciting. And again, to echo the point of Dean Sumner, the fact is that these are topics that I think everybody here probably already knows a good amount about. I'm going to be presenting just some base level material. I'm going to talk a little bit about autism in general, some of the more recent research and some of the things that are happening at our center at Marcus, as well as some of the work that we've done outside of Georgia and nationwide in some cases. And then I'm going to maybe hone in a little bit on some of the areas where I do more work directly, which is really dealing with some of the safety types of issues that come up with individuals on the spectrum. So in terms of just kind of format, I got slides here. I can talk at you all day if that's what we need, but I find that these things oftentimes go best if it's a little bit more interactive, a little more Q&A. I'd rather talk about the topics that you're interested in or address the questions you might have. And so this is not one of those hold your questions to the end. This is hey, that doesn't make sense, or I want to know more about that. Put my hand up and ask a question. So I would much rather spend our time that way. And if we don't get to all the slides, I've kind of set it up so that the less interesting stuff's at the end anyway. So it don't matter, right? The other thing I'll say is I've had a lot of just different titles that were read off at the beginning. My favorite title is that according to a box of mac and cheese, I'm a family of four. But one of my former titles is that I used to be a professor at LSU and I used to teach undergrads. There you go, right? There you go. Now, he's already my favorite. Sorry, guys. So I used to teach undergrads, and one of the lessons I learned is that uncomfortable silence is my best ally. So there may be a moment where if I'm just finding that I'm doing all the talking and nobody's asking questions, I'll just pause for a minute and we'll see who puts their hand up and asks a question. So I'm going to encourage you now, but if it comes to that, we can make that a reality for you. So I'm going to start with just a real quick statistic, right? So prevalence numbers, and actually these are even a little bit outdated now. 1 in 35 children in Georgia meet criteria for a diagnosis of autism by age 8, and that exceeds the number of kids combined with diabetes, cancer, cerebral palsy, cystic fibrosis, AIDS, Down syndrome, muscular dystrophy, right? I mean, that is a pretty significant. When I first read that statistic, I realized, oh my gosh, this is highly prevalent. But think about what that means, right? So think about average class size in Georgia, right? 20 plus kids per class? It means that you're in a school with more than one class per grade. Your kid has a classmate on the spectrum, right? That's just the numbers, right? And yet you think about how much funding and investment is in some of these areas. Childhood cancer has 10 times the research funding of autism that this nation provides. And yet, way more kids on the spectrum than are going to have cancer. Not saying that we don't need to do great research on cancer, we don't need to have great services for those kids, but just in terms of kind of the imbalance between those things. So this is the first thing, this is that first pause I'm going to give, right? So there's a really obvious question here. And I'm going to see if any one of you might put your hand up and ask the question. So I'm going to do my little thing where I pause and see who's my huckleberry today. All right? What? There you go. See, it didn't even take but a moment. She knew I meant business. That's why. Why is that number going up? It's a really normal question that a lot of people have. Why do we see increasing prevalence? I remember when I first got started in this field, it was 180 something, 1 out of 180. And just every time they release these statistics, the numbers keep going up and up and up. So there's some reasons why, and I think it's worth talking a little bit about that. First of all, I think it's important to know that the raw number of kids who actually have autism is probably going up, but it's only going up a tiny bit, right? These kinds of vast growth in the number of kids who meet criteria is probably not because, something in the water. It's definitely not vaccines, right? There's things that we know it's not. Some of the factors that do contribute to this number going up. First is something we would just call diagnostic substitution. There's a lot of things that used to be called something else that now people call autism, right? It used to be that, that you would say that things that people would thought would be incompatible with autism, for example. So like Down syndrome is a good example, trisomy 21. It used to be people said, well, that kid can't have autism. He's got Down syndrome. Now we actually know those two things actually go together, that you're more likely to meet criteria for a diagnosis of autism if you have Down syndrome than before. So things that used to be called intellectual disability, or, we don't use the term anymore, but it used to be called mental retardation. As people kind of understand more about those individuals, we're realizing, well, that's actually probably autism. And so we're now calling it something different because there's greater understanding of what autism is. And therefore we're seeing individuals who used to have a different diagnosis get that diagnosis. So that's part of the issue. Another is just increased awareness. People know more about autism than they used to know. As a result, you're seeing that there's more people being diagnosed. Kids are getting screened. Now it's required for pediatricians to do screenings as part of those baby checkups. So people are aware. They're doing more testing. The kids are getting tested earlier. And if you think about kind of the distribution of people who are getting that diagnosis, once upon a time, it was like, well, people would say, well, let's wait and see. Or only the kids with the most obvious signs, the kids with the most profound forms of autism would be the ones who would be getting that diagnosis. And now we're seeing much broader range of that spectrum being diagnosed. Let me just give you an example of that. I was in the grocery store maybe 6 months ago, right? I'm doing the checkout aisle or whatever. And the checkout lady was like, I was wearing some of my Marcus t-shirt or whatever. She's like, oh, you work at an autism center? I said, yeah. She said, 2 of my friends are on the spectrum. I said, oh, that's really interesting. Tell me about that, right? She said, yeah, they got diagnosed by TikTok. So, it's one of those things where they want to, do you have autism? And 3 simple questions kind of a thing, right? Like that's a whole different culture as it comes to autism than when there's a lot of stigma 20, 30 years ago, right? When I first started working in this field, all anybody knew about autism was Dustin Hoffman. Some of you are younger than me, and I'll say Dustin Hoffman was in a movie that's called Rain Man, and he played an autistic man, right? So there was a whole thing where that's really all anybody thought about was the more profound form of autism where individuals really needed a lot of supports and so forth, kind of co-occurring intellectual disability. And the spectrum of what is considered autism is really much more broad than it used to be. And so you're getting more people who are getting a diagnosis than used to be the case in the past, right? So that's another contributing factor. We have better measures as well, right? So again, it used to be that, to get a diagnosis, you had to go see the super highly trained diagnostician who had spent years and years of their life getting expert at providing a diagnosis. Now there's measures that can be done at screening. Again, baby checkups. Maybe not TikTok, right? Stay away from the TikTok diagnosis if it's okay. If you take anything away from this, maybe that's the thing to remember. So there's a whole host of kids who are being diagnosed younger, people who are being diagnosed for the full spectrum that used to be just maybe one subset of that spectrum, and diagnostic substitution. All of these things probably contribute to there being increased numbers. Now, I will say, when you account for all of that, there is still some small increase in the actual number of kids being diagnosed with autism or who meet criteria for autism as well. That's the part that folks don't quite understand as well. There's a lot of research going into why that's the case. There's different things that have been found, and a lot of the science is still not clear. But one thing that for a minute people kind of have said, well, age of the father at the time of conception was correlated with an autism diagnosis, right? Well, people are having families later. They start having kids later. Maybe there's these social factors that contribute to that. Are there certain things in the environment? Maybe, but if there are, they tend to be very small contributors, if at all. Certainly not the kind of thing that we hear about on social media or in the news or in the press, where it's like, well, this is all about red food dye or what have you, right? Doesn't mean that these things are good for you. Doesn't mean that there's very, very, very small increases in probabilities, but it's not the kind of thing that there's a smoking gun, one thing out there, vaccine, something like that, that's causing this rise in the prevalence. Did I answer your question about why? I got a shrug. All right, well, we'll see if I can't do better as we go through this thing. If I come back to this and we can talk a little bit more as we go through it. So I think it's really important before we go much further to talk about what do we mean by autism, right? What does autism actually mean? And I think there are folks here who probably know this really well and probably better than me even, right? But when it comes to autism, there's really two core criteria and kind of a bonus criterion, right? The main features that are required in order to get an autism diagnosis are first and foremost deficits in social communication, and then restricted interests or repetitive behavior. Okay. I'll talk a little bit what those mean, because those are kind of like the technical definitions, and it's not always really clear cut what those look like in real life. When we talk about deficits in social communication, really we're talking about the way that individual kids relate to other people, right? And that can include spoken communication, but also nonverbal communication, the way that kids interact with. I'm going to start out just maybe with a quick disclaimer. I work with kids. I'm going to say kids. Obviously, I hope it's clear that everything I'm talking about applies to adults on the spectrum as well. It's just a little tick that I have because I'm so focused on working with kids. I'm in pediatrics, and so that's part of why. But I hope that nobody takes that to mean that anything I'm saying is restricted to children. But when social deficits or deficits in social communication, again, how individuals relate to or engage or interact with other people, can be qualitative and can be just, there's a little bit different or a little bit off. It can be quantitative. Kids who are completely nonverbal, don't talk to other people, right? So they can be really different. And at the end of this talk, if we get through some of these slides, there'll be a sum up slide. And one of the things I'll say is that if you take anything away from this, the number one point I hope you hear from me is how much heterogeneity there is. We call it a spectrum for a reason, right? It's kind of a cliche for those who work with individuals on the autism spectrum. And I'm going to allow myself just a second to engage in that. And that cliche is, when you've met one kid with autism, you've met one kid with autism, right? There's so much variability, and you can't make a whole lot of assumptions. These categories look really, really different depending on that individual kid in my case, right? And I'll talk about that and give some more examples. Another is restricted interests and repetitive behavior. Again, that can look wildly different depending on the individual child. You can see kids who really engage in repetitive motor behavior, body rocking, hand flapping, these types of things. Or restricted interests, where they're really focused in on one or two really specific things. So just to give kind of examples of how that can look from a breadth standpoint. I worked with one kid who was really into shipwrecks. Right? Like, he was maybe 11 years old, and he had memorized the longitude and latitude of every major shipwreck in the North Atlantic during World War II. He can tell you the name of the captain and its cargo and how it sank. Like, that was his jam, man. It was like shipwrecks, right? And so he was really interested in that. On the other hand, we had a kid who was really into ceiling fans, loved ceiling fans, right? And like, that was his thing. And if he was really well behaved, his family would take him to Home Depot on the weekend so he could watch the ceiling fans go around. And like, he would watch the ceiling fan channel on YouTube, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's kind of like the fireplace channel, but ceiling fans, right? So this kid was really into ceiling fans. This kid is really into shipwrecks. Seems like kind of two very different things. And yet the one kid was so into ceiling fans that he'd spent his whole life focusing on ceiling fans, never took the time to learn how to talk, right? And would let himself into the neighbor's house without knocking, turn on their ceiling fans at high speed and jam broom handles into it, right? And like, turns out people don't like that. So it became a big issue. So, wide variability, also really just interested in really specific topics, down to repetitive behavior like body rocking. Sometimes families will talk about rigidity. So you'll hear families say, like, I didn't realize my kid even knew the way home from daycare until we turned left because there was a detour one time and he flipped out, right? Because they were just focused on this same way every time, this fixation on and inflexibility, rigidity. These are all features that can show up just within this simple little set of words that say restricted interest and repetitive behavior, can look vastly different across individuals. So it's something to really think about. Same thing, again, going back to social deficits, that kid I was telling you about who was really into shipwrecks. Again, his whole thing was shipwrecks, and he'd go out on the playground at lunch at school and he'd go to his peers and he'd say, hey guys, you want to play Titanic? Right? And because that's what he's into, right? Is shipwrecks. And he'd say, you guys want to play Titanic? And the other kids would say, like, what are you talking about? Right? Now, think about the fact that this is an individual who is having some deficits in social communication and doesn't necessarily pick up on those social messages that are oftentimes conveyed in how we exchange or how we interact with one another. So from his standpoint, what he hears is, what are you talking about? As in, like, tell me more, right? He hears the literal words, what are you talking about? But that's not what those kids were saying, was it? What were they saying? What was the real message? Dude, you're being weird, right? Like, dude, you're being weird. And he's like, well, the Titanic was a ship that's main port was in Ireland. He would tell him all these facts about the Titanic because he thought, tell me more, right? He's missing the social message in that form of communication. So These are how these things oftentimes show up. Just one example of how this can show up, and it can look so vastly different across individuals. The last area, and one that folks really key in on, but is actually not necessarily a requirement to have an autism diagnosis, but is far more common, is sensitivity sensory stimuli. It can be hyper or hyposensitivity. So things like loud noises, flashing lights. We see a lot of kids who turn up in the emergency department at Children's who are on the spectrum. And, you think about the worst possible place for a kid if you're on the spectrum is an ED, where there's alarms going off and people rushing in and out and shouting and kids crying and all these things, this chaos and noise. It's really a bad fit for a lot of our kids. But you also have kids who seek out certain forms of sensory stimulation. Flashing lights and loud noises might actually be really preferred for some kids. So just not making a ton of assumptions about how these things show up. I remember we had a conversation. There's some really well-meaning folks at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta who said that they wanted to really make sure that the kids on the spectrum got good medical care. And so they looked into it and they found this thing called the Vecta machine, which sounds super creepy to me. I don't know why, but basically it's like a rave on wheels. It's about this size and it comes in, it's got flashing lights and like things that blows bubbles and fans and does all, it's supposed to provide all these sources of stimulation, and they cost like way too much money. And I said, you could get 30 iPads for that. You know what? And an iPad, you know what an iPad has? The ceiling fan channel, right? iPads do everything, right? So like this was, my point being, making assumptions about what is going to be interesting or engaging for a kid with autism. Oftentimes we make a lot of mistakes because it might be ceiling fans and you're never going to know unless you really get to know that individual a little bit. Make sense? Questions about any of this stuff? Am I missing anything? Again, I much prefer to engage in interaction, but my wife says you put a quarter in me, you got to listen to the whole song. So I could just go if that's what's preferred, if we don't have any other topics you guys want to discuss. All right, this looks really complicated and confusing, but this is some data from some of the researchers at Marcus Autism Center, and this is some work that was done looking at eye tracking. Okay, and I want to explain a little bit about what you're seeing on the screen. So on the left, the red lines and the red dots represent kids on the autism spectrum. The right represents neurotypical kids, or kids without an autism diagnosis. And this was some work that was originally, if people kind of know anything about autism, they kind of know like eye contact's a thing, right? I don't really know what that means, but I know eye contact is a thing. That's oftentimes something people have heard somewhere or picked up. And that's really stuff that was done by researchers who are at Marcus Autism Center. And what they really did early on was look at using eye tracking to show people videos and see what they would pay attention to, and actually found that individuals on the spectrum were paying attention to other things that were going on the screen. So most of us, when we talk to someone else or we're engaging with someone else, what are we looking at? Their eyes, right? Most of us. That's typically what we do. Whereas what they found was that folks on the spectrum were looking at things in the background, or they might look at the speaker's mouth, and actually they showed that there's audio-visual synchrony, that the mouth moves in concert with kind of the noises that are coming out. And if you're like any other audience I've ever spoken to, then right now you're saying like, am I looking at his eyes or am I looking at his mouth? What am I doing? I'm on the spectrum, which may be true. We don't know, right? But regardless, that eye gaze thing was something that was really a robust finding. And so if you look, what's really interesting here is if you look at the bottom scale, right? That's age of the individual. These are kids who were the same kids reevaluated every couple of months, all the way down at 2 months of age, right? These are babies that they were doing some early eye tracking work on. And what you see is a difference in how kids on the spectrum are paying attention to the eyes versus the neurotypical kids, right? The neurotypical kids kind of fluctuates a little bit, but kind of stays in that zone, whereas the kids on the spectrum starts high and kind of drops off over time, right? So really good question. Why, right? Why would that be the case? The interesting thing is, if autism is some rigid construct that, exists at birth and never changes, the real question is, why is it right around the same level at 2 months of age, whether you're neurotypical or not, right? That's the question. Why is it that the kids on the spectrum, they're looking at the eyes just as much as the other kids when they're 2 months old, but over time, they gradually do less and less of that, right? And so some of the thinking right now is that one of the reasons for this is what we would call kind of a social motivation theory, right? That kids on the spectrum start out reflexively, just like every other kid. Baby's born, and I don't know if you have kids, but you've held that infant in your arms, and you lock eyes, and there's like oxytocin floods your system, and you're like, oh my gosh, I would lay down in traffic for this person, like whatever it takes, right? And that child is feeling some of that in return most of the time. The thing is, and that is an initial just reflexive behavior at those really early ages that are just happening. The thing that was suspected is happening with kids on the spectrum is that they are not getting that same feeling, that same rewarding, reciprocal feeling as the parent might be, or at least not to the same degree. And so just like anybody, when you do something that doesn't produce as much reward for you, you do kind of less and less of it, right? So you're seeing over time, kids are locking eyes or looking at people, paying attention to faces a little bit less than the other kids, right? So now that doesn't necessarily mean, well, what about those? That's not a symptom. You looked at those features of autism and nowhere on that did it say doesn't pay attention to other people or doesn't, engage in eye contact. Those were things like social reciprocity and social communication and restricted behavior. So how does that come from the eye gaze thing? Again, telling you kind of what the thinking is about this. So what we do seem to know is that autism unfolds in those early stages of development. It's a thing that develops. The features that we call autism develop in part because of these kinds of patterns. That think about what you learn from paying attention to other people, right? If you're paying attention to other people, what do you learn? I always say you learn about the things you pay attention to. That's why my kid knows so much about Fortnite, right? Because that's what he pays attention to. Now, if you're paying attention to people at these really critical early stages with neuroplasticity and all that, what do you learn about? You're learning about people. You're learning to engage, to what a smile means. You're learning about, as you get a little bit older, you learn to talk. As you get a little bit older, you learn about turn taking and communication and conversations and that kind of thing. But if you're not paying attention to people, you're missing out on all of those really critical experiences that help us become the social beings that many of us, most of us are, right? And that's what's happening in these cases. These kids they're missing those critical opportunities to learn from that social world around them. And so that's where you're starting to see kids who have these deficits who don't pick up on, what are you talking about, right? That's where this stuff is probably coming from. The other thing, though, is if you're not paying attention to people, you're paying attention to something. Maybe you're paying attention to ceiling fans. I don't know, right? So you find that these kids may become more fixated or maybe really focused on other things around them. There's lots of questions. Is it push or is it pull, right? Are they really drawn to those other things, or is it like in the absence of anything else, that's what they're going to focus on? So there's still a lot of work to do in this area, but this is some of the more cutting edge research in this area. One thing that's come from this, again, just talking about some of the work that's gone on at Marcus Autism Center. If you look at this figure here, it's a little confusing, but if you look, the two little panels there kind of turned on their side represent a video clip, right? And so basically it's about, 900 milliseconds go by and what is going on within that clip. So you can see like time going by, and the little rainbow part represents what kids are paying attention to. Okay. So you can see they're like, as they're looking at that, they're using eye tracking to show what part of that video clip or that frame of video are they actually looking at. And you'll see over time that there will be these moments like that red part right there, where basically that means all the kids focus in on the exact same point. All the kids are looking at the same thing at that moment in time. And then they maybe look a little bit around other parts of the video and they look at other things, and then they come back and they all look at the same thing. And these are neurotypical kids at this point, right? One of the things that was found that was really fascinating was some of this work has led to even doing this with monozygotic and dizygotic twins. So identical twins, same DNA, and kids who are non-identical twins, right? Share 50%, just like any other set of siblings. And what they found was that the twins who had the same DNA had 90% or more agreement on what they were looking at any video, at any split second of any video at any given time, right? That this is so biologically driven, right? You think about, look, what are we looking at? Seems so random, and yet this is a genetically attributable feature that we can account for. So this work now has led to actually the creation of a device that uses this eye tracking. It's using a screen. So this work, when they first started doing this at Marcus Autism Center, I mean, it was a room-sized lab with eye tracking equipment. Now it's shrunk down to basically the size of a laptop, where a child can sit and watch some of these videos. It received FDA authorization about 1.5 years ago to be used as a diagnostic tool. And so we are working with Mercer to figure out how we can use this to make this accessible to actually address diagnostic services in rural Georgia, to figure out how kids can get because this is one of those areas where there's a huge bottleneck in just being able to access services, in part because if you can't get a diagnosis, you don't have the means to access some of those services. And so we're excited to do some of that work. I'm going to pause again for a second. Questions or anything anybody wants to ask about any of that stuff before I move into more talking about services in other areas of autism? Yes.
Those little things in there.
So I should be really clear, there's a company that does not Marcus Autism Center. We are a customer. Basically what happened is the folks who did that research sold the intellectual property off to a separate company that is developing those. They'll sell them to folks. They'll put them in. But, our work is mostly on how do we get these into the hands of providers and make sure that they're being used for best effect. That's the work that we're really doing, is thinking about Georgia and how do we make sure the kids of Georgia get the care that they need. We think this is a part of that solution potentially. But we are not the ones selling this stuff. I'm not here to sell you on anything because we don't get any royalties or anything like that. We're just thinking about how do we take care of Georgia's kids. Yes.
Is that part of your screening?
So we use it right now. It's authorized as a diagnostic tool, not a screener. FDA really limits what you can market something as. And so we use that. Medicaid has a requirement that there be 2 measures that get done in order to get a diagnosis. There has to be a clinician administered one and a caregiver questionnaire survey, right? So this has been approved by the state of Georgia to be used as that clinician measure. And I'm keep moving just because I'm not here to sell you anything. That's not what I'm here to do. We're excited about the research. We're excited about the opportunity. And Marcus really is focused on how do we partner with groups like Mercer to get these tools in the hands of providers. Yeah.
Sorry, I got a voice on the jet. In the study with monozygotic and dizygotic twins, was social environment of the twins accounted for? What I'm asking is, were they both, if they're
Living together.
monozygotic, were they raised in the same home
Yeah.
their entire lives, or were they in different environments?
My understanding is that they were living with the same household in both cases, right? So when it comes to all right, now what do we do to help support kids and families, autistic kids and their families? We think a lot about this as an ecosystem, right? The reality is there's a lot of pieces. Autism for a long time was kind of categorized as a pervasive developmental disorder. Pervasive just meaning it affects so many facets of life, right? If you think about some of those key features that I just described, the fact that there's deficits in social communication or how you interact with other people, that shows up in so many aspects of life. It really expands beyond just hey, we got one clinic, or it influences education, it influences healthcare, it influences employment, it influences so many different features of life. And so thinking about this as an ecosystem is really how we try to approach the role that we at Marcus Autism Center play, and what are the things that we can do, but how do we work with other groups to try to scale up and make sure that services are being met everywhere. One of the ways that we try to think about kind of just categorizing services, if you will, these are some broad categories. So we talk about diagnostics, of course, in order to just identify kids. There's screening, there's identifying, is this kid on the spectrum? And then there's what are sometimes referred to as comprehensive treatments or interventions. These are services that are focusing on kind of those core features and trying to address all of those needs at once. So services like ABA is an example of something that would oftentimes be, the way people think about ABA at least, is oftentimes what we would call a comprehensive intervention. But there are other approaches as well. And one of the things we worry a little bit about is you talk to pediatricians and they'll say, well, my kid got diagnosed in my practice and now I need to sign him up for ABA like it's a reflex. And the truth is that's oftentimes true, but it's not true for every kid. Figuring out what's the right service. And so that's some of the work that we're trying to do with pediatricians to help provide training, and so that they understand which kids are a good fit for those types of services and which kids might need something else, like a naturalistic developmental behavioral intervention or other types of approaches. One of the ways to kind of differentiate comprehensive is to think about more focused treatments. So focused treatments are those that really are trying to address a specific issue, and it isn't trying to address everything. So we're going to hear a talk in just a little bit about feeding disorder and kids who are so selective, who are on the spectrum in terms of what foods they'll eat, that they start to show up with nutritional problems like scurvy. When we actually see kids, think about that for a second, right? We really do see kids with scurvy. It's 2025, and I'm like, this is like 1800s, pirates, that kind of thing. They knew how to avoid scurvy. But hey, if you only eat the insides of McDonald's French fries from a really specific McDonald's near your house, which is a real thing, right? The first question I have for that kid is, that's the worst part of the French fry. What's wrong? Because the greasy, salty, crispy part is the good part. But whatever, regardless, you start to have big nutritional problems if you're only eating one thing like that, right? So the feeding disorders would be a good example. Other issues that are not necessarily autism, but are kind of downstream consequences of autism. There's nothing in those criteria I said that was saying that feeding disorder was part of autism. But if you're really hypersensitive to certain things, sensory stimuli like tastes and textures, Well, maybe you're not eating everything, right? So that would be an example of how that would be more of a downstream effect. Other issues that we work on a lot in our center would be things like complex behavior needs or challenging behavior, like elopement, kids who wander away from caregivers. If you don't have good communication and you're not really paying attention to people, it's the leading contributor to the fact that kids on the spectrum have double the premature death rate of their neurotypical peers. And drowning is the biggest issue, but it's also abduction and car accidents and all kinds of things that can come about if a kid just wanders away from safety. So working on some of those kinds of issues with those more focused treatments. But then it's also and those tend to be focused on one end of the spectrum, but it's also suicidality, right? It's kids who show up in the ED. And if you go to an ED in Atlanta these days, a pediatric ED, what you'll find is the number of kids who are in there for suicidality is shockingly and scarily high, but about 20% of those kids are on the spectrum, right? And figuring out how do we help those kids. One of the first things we learned when we set up a clinical program for that specifically was the number one thing you can do for those kids is give them a diagnosis, because oftentimes they don't have that diagnosis and they realize when they get that diagnosis, oh, I'm not the only kid in the world who's dealing with some of these issues, who's getting bullied for these kinds of things. And when there's a name for it and there's other kids like me that I can meet who have some of these same features, that's oftentimes the biggest thing that changes their perspective, and you can start to work with them differently. So really, again, like the range of needs is so vast, and Marcus tries to meet as many of those as we can, but I'm not going to sit here and tell you we've got everything licked, by no means, but we are constantly trying to think about what are the pieces that are missing that we can add. And then the last thing is where these services are delivered. So again, we have a center in Atlanta, which it's one of the biggest in the country. Some of our services, feeding program, biggest in the world, we believe. Same thing with our complex behavior supports needs programs. These are very large programs. But we're in Atlanta, and families can't get to Atlanta. And some of these services, being the biggest in the world, means you get families who are traveling from. We had a patient we just discharged back to California. These are families who oftentimes travel, but California versus Valdosta, for some families, it's an ocean away almost, right? And so how do we figure out how we provide services to expand beyond just those center-based services? I've been an investigator on several projects using telehealth. We've had some NIH funding to show that a lot of these services can be delivered successfully via telehealth, but not all of them. And so for those that you can't, how do we make sure that we're really doing everything we can to expand, to grow capacity, and so on? All right. Questions about any of this? Yes.
I was just going to make a comment that the other problem of being such a big and well-known center is the wait time.
Yep. 100%.
And taking a year.
Yeah. So well aware of the fact that for our center, at least, our reputation is Marcus is great if you can get in, but you can't, right? 100% fully aware of that. And I will say, I've been in the role at Marcus that I'm in now. I mean, I've been there since 2006, but I'm in the role of the vice president for children's over the Marcus Autism Center just for about 2 years. And when we developed a new strategic plan, that was the first thing I did. And I'll tell you that is entirely focused on access, right? How are we going to scale up and grow access? Because, as a clinician, the thing that I lose sleep over, literally, right, is that there's kids and families out there who aren't getting the care that they need, and that we could have done something about that. And so that is very much a focus. I'll tell you, it's not a simple solution, right? Some of it has to do with things like funding. Some of these services are not covered by insurance. And so how do you scale them up? How do you grow them? I'll tell you that some of the recent legislation has us really concerned, because it's like not that it's retracting some of the things that might have been available before, or at least we're scared about that. So there's a lot of issues, but it is 100% something that we are well aware of and lose sleep over, and are trying to do everything we possibly can within the framework of what's possible in the state of Georgia. But a big part of that is partnering with groups like Mercer, right? And finding the right partners, so that we're trying to expand some of those services, especially into areas where I think Mercer, the focus on rural communities and rural health has so much expertise that we can lean on to understand how to make a difference in those communities, so you don't go in and make assumptions and think, well, we're the big center, like you said, from Atlanta, we know everything. No, we know we don't know everything, and we rely on partners to help us figure out how to do it well. There's another hand up over here. Yes.
Outside of the ABA therapy, are there any other comprehensive treatments that you could?
So I mentioned, so there was a paper that came out back in 2014. I think the lead author was Schreibman, but there were essentially, this was, all right, this is how I oftentimes, my wife loves this about tolerates this about me, which is, I tend to go off on tangents. So you know how like music groups every so often they'll have like a super group, right? And they'll get the guitarist from like Led Zeppelin and the drummer from Megadeth, whatever, right? And they form a supergroup. This was like the supergroup paper of autism researchers, right? They got all these people together and they wrote a paper together. And prior to that, there were a lot of people who kind of had these branded treatments. It was like, I do Jasper. Like Connie Cassery is this researcher out in California who does this thing called Jasper. And it's like a brand, right? And so a lot of what Connie Cassery was doing was research on showing that Jasper works and like, but don't pay attention to that other stuff, right? Do the Jasper thing. And then you've got Amy Weatherby doing certs, and you've got Brooke Ingersoll doing impact, or all these different things, right? And they came together and they did something pretty remarkable, which was they wrote a paper and they said, you know what? These things are way more similar than they are different. Right? These are like, yes, there might be some differences on the margins, but they're, for the most part, they have a lot in common. Right. And so they called these the naturalistic developmental behavioral interventions, NDBIs. Right. And they share a lot of and say it again. Was that what that was? Naturalistic developmental behavioral interventions, or NDBIs. Now, they too have a lot in common with ABA, right? I'll be really clear about that. And NDBIs, especially though, are targeting young kids, right? Those kids in that like 18 months to 5 years of age time frame in particular, and does that particularly well. So I think that, the moral of that story is like, maybe stay away from brands. And if ever anybody tells you like, this is the magic thing that only works, right? Like, be skeptical. But there are that paper, one of the things it did really well is it outlined what are the features of all of these things that they share in common. What are the things, and it talks about things like there are behavioral strategies being employed. They're all based on behavior analysis, much like some of the ABA services tend to be, right? And so it goes through those and lists out all of those features, almost like look, if you go into a place that says they're providing services for kids with autism, checklist, right? Are they doing these things, right? Because that's probably telling you something about this is an appropriate approach, or something that has evidence that it'll produce good outcomes.
Do you have the name of that?
So that's 2014, and the author's first name is Schreibman, S-C-H, now you're really pushing me now. S-C-H-R-I-E-B-M-A-N, and it might be 2 N's at the end, I think. I'm close. You got it right there in front of you, right? Oh, yeah. She's like hands up, like it's right here.
I want to ask a question about music therapy.
Sure. Music therapy. So there are a lot of services, or a lot of interventions and therapies that kids on the spectrum will enjoy, right? And it will then, like, again, we talked about sensory sensitivities, we talked about restricted interest. So some kids might find certain things really engaging, and might be and might actually find those things calming or soothing, right? And that can include music. It can include, there are other therapies that people put forward in the past, things like brushing or weighted blankets and these kinds of things, right? And so the question I would always have for those kinds of approaches is, what are they for? If the point is to provide somebody with something that they find soothing, especially if they're in a situation where they're maybe a little escalated and feeling a little out of control, and this helps them calm down, great, right? If the intervention is there to get a nonverbal child to talk, probably not a lot of evidence that that's going to accomplish that. Does that make sense? Yeah. Great questions, though. So I want to hit on this point again about heterogeneity. So I mentioned before the vast range. And so these are data from actually back maybe 4 or 5 years ago, or maybe even longer ago, that were the instance where the CDC does this surveillance data, and they do like, I think 12 different states. Georgia's one of them. And they actually do a comprehensive assessment to see how many kids in that state by age 8 meet criteria for an autism diagnosis. And that's where those 1 in 35, 1 in 36 numbers are coming from. And so in 2019 or 2016 was the first time those data showed that the ratio flipped from the majority of kids on the spectrum also meeting criteria for an intellectual disability to no longer meeting criteria for an intellectual disability, right? So the majority of kids nowadays who meet criteria for an autism diagnosis have average IQ or higher, right? And I think that, again, is just something that folks don't think about necessarily. Like, again, when I was kind of coming up, and that was seen as those two things went together. And now I think what we know is that there is much more diversity and breadth, and that most individuals on the spectrum are going to be typical IQ. Now, that doesn't mean that they can be in a regular education class with other kids, right? Because some of those features of autism might still interfere with their ability to engage in a class or learn from typical instruction and so forth. But it doesn't mean that they can't learn, and it doesn't mean that they aren't smart. It just means that this is a difference in that for them, that they may need some accommodations and adaptations. And the heterogeneity extends well beyond just IQ. Things like some of those restricted interests, what those might look like. Everything from like flapping your hand to looking at ceiling fans to being obsessed with shipwrecks. A lot of breadth there. The types of comorbidities or things that go along with that. Feeding problems, aggression, suicidality. There's other psychiatric concerns. There can be a lot of breadth in what those can show up and look like. Emotionality, how they engage socially, sensory sensitivity, all these things I think can be really, really broad and look really, really different, which means that you really have to take a minute and get to know that individual if you're trying to be there to be supportive of them. Because making those assumptions, just because you know one kid with autism doesn't mean you know anything about this individual with autism, right? And so that can mean, again, that this spectrum is really, truly the case, right? That you can see differences all the way from individuals who are nonverbal, who are not speaking, who are really requiring a lot of support, round-the-clock care, all the way to folks who are doing fine in most respects, have a job, have good relationships, are married, have a lot going for them in all the ways that most of us would be jealous of. That still doesn't, autism does not preclude that wide spectrum. In fact, it's something that is really interesting and exciting about autism. And I think one of the things that this has led to that folks really, it is increasingly coming to the forefront is this idea of neurodiversity, right? Think back to my experience at the grocery store where my friend her friends are getting diagnosed with TikTok, right? That stigma that maybe existed with autism 20 years ago really seems to have gone away. And some of that comes down to something as simple as the DSM-5, right? So the DSM, for those who don't know, is kind of the manual that includes those criteria that say this is what autism is, right? And the DSM-5, the most recent version, really changed some things from the previous version. So the previous version actually had a whole section of disorders that it called autism or autism spectrum disorders, and included things like pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified, childhood disintegrative disorder, Rett syndrome, autism, Asperger's syndrome was a one that people heard about for a long time, right? And a lot of people were familiar with. And then the DSM-5 comes along. And the DSM-5 folks kind of said, you know what? Like, these are all the same criteria, right? What I was just saying, that these are all those same three categories. They just show up so differently. So rather than call them different things, let's just say it's autism and acknowledge that there's a lot of heterogeneity there, right? Well, think about what that means from a real world standpoint. That means that there are a whole lot of people who went to bed on Monday with Asperger's syndrome and woke up on Tuesday with autism, right? And so that has led to a lot of people kind of reflecting, and those folks who were maybe in that category or who have since been diagnosed with autism, no intellectual disability, at the far left, or my left, your right of that spectrum that I just showed, right? Who are successful in many facets of life and are able to kind of get by or are doing really well, thriving in many respects. And those are folks who have autism too. They meet those criteria. And so if I were to just kind of vocalize some of the expression of how that has affected some of those people, many of them will say things like, there's nothing wrong with me. I don't need fixing, right? I don't need intervention. I'm doing okay. And one of the things that has led to as well is identification with autism. Think about that group of kids I talked about earlier with suicidality, where when they learn there's other kids like me, that affiliation, that sense of there's others like me, and autism is not a bad thing, it's just part of who we are, that has led to a movement of folks who are really talking about autism as a form of identity, right? And so this neurodiversity movement is really a push for people who are saying, look, yeah, we're autistic. And you even see it in terms of the words that we use to talk about autism. So when I was first starting working in this field, we really heard that we were supposed to use person-first language, right? I don't know if you know what that means, but it really literally means putting the person first when we talk about them. We don't say, we weren't supposed to say an autistic child. We said a child with autism. In the same way that you wouldn't say a cancerous child, you would say a child with cancer, because he's a kid first. First and foremost, he's a child who just happens to have this thing, right? And with this change, what we're seeing is people saying, no, autism is part of who I am, right? I am autistic. It's part of how I identify, and that's part of who I am. And I think that that is largely a very healthy thing, but it has created some interesting dynamics, right? Because there are other folks who, especially individuals who care for those folks who can't advocate for themselves in some of those kind of ways, who are saying, well, we're really happy that autism is seen as a full community and all that, but that perspective maybe doesn't represent my child's perspective, the child or the individual I'm caring for who needs round-the-clock care, and maybe they do need intervention. And so there is this little bit of I don't want to say schism is putting it strongly, but there are these two different points of view in the world right now, and I would argue that both have a lot of valid points that they're making, and it's really tricky to kind of find and navigate how we talk about this in ways that are respectful to everyone, make sure everyone's getting what they need and the supports that they need, while not necessarily minimize or diminishing the point of view of the other. So if you're working with individuals on the spectrum, this may come up for you, and that's partly why I'm bringing it up, because you may find folks who feel strongly one way or the other, and the words that we use and the way we talk about this can sometimes be viewed as hurtful, and that's never the intention. So I think it's good to just have a little bit of awareness about this. So I'm hoping that's just a little bit of something I could put on your radar and make you aware of. Questions about any of this? No, I'm looking at the clock. I got about 9 minutes. So I think, again, part of this becomes really critical in terms of how we think about supporting, and I'm talking about kids again on the autism spectrum. The biggest thing is to recognize that these features are prevalent across the board, but there's a lot of heterogeneity, and how we understand where they're at and approach them where they're at and get them what they need can be really important. I've mentioned here also, just kind of went out of order and talked about even diagnosis can be therapeutic. I'm going to skip ahead just a little bit to get to some of the things that I think are more important. So I've talked about this idea. The term profound autism is really being used in that kind of neurodiversity, kind of as the end of the spectrum. I think as that neurodiversity movement has unfolded and as people have started to advocate for being autistic and autistic identity, there are, again, I think that group of individuals, and it's mostly caregivers who take care of individuals with more significant support needs, who have said, that in some cases the attention has shifted, the pendulum has swung so far to focusing on the needs of those individuals that maybe they've been left out. And so they've started to talk about profound autism as a term that might actually be able to refer to them and their needs, and really defining that based on individuals who need round-the-clock care. That's really the root of that term, profound autism. All right, so I'm going to talk a little about when we have engaged with caregivers, especially, and individuals who are on the spectrum, and especially, but the parents of kids who are younger, and again, we mostly work with kids. When we talk with them about what are the number one factors that influence their quality of life and the quality of life of their loved ones, they generally talk about behavior being the biggest challenge. So things like aggression, self-injury, elopement I mentioned earlier, these are things that are oftentimes affecting quality of life in really significant ways. And at Marcus, we serve these kids. I mentioned we have one of the biggest programs that works with these patients and families. And these things can be very substantially impactful on them. And I'll just give you one example that really affected me. This was a family that I worked with. And I remember talking to this mom as she started our program, and I said, how you doing? Because she was waiting. She was one of those families who waited for a long time to get services. And I said, how are you doing? And she said, things aren't great, but we're getting by. I said, well, tell me what getting by looks like for you. And she said, well, our son, when he gets mad, and he was probably 12, I think at the time, when he gets mad, we take ourselves and our two little girls into the back bedroom. We barricade ourselves inside with some heavy furniture. It's usually about 45 minutes to an hour before we can come out. We have to look at how many holes there are in the wall because we have a drywall budget, and we need to know if we're over budget for that month. All the windows are screwed shut, and there's plexiglass over those. We don't have a lot of stuff in the house. We eat our meals off of paper plates. Our son's room is barren other than a mattress. We actually cook our meals in the garage because we keep all our appliances out there because he destroyed our washing machine. We actually use the washing room as the playroom because we can let our little girls keep their toys in there, and we can lock them inside so that they'll be safe so our son can't reach them. There's 2 deadbolts on the door. I keep one key around my neck. My husband keeps the other key around his neck, because if our son knocks one of us unconscious, we know that he can turn a key, because the last time we only had one key, and he got the key and he got out of the house, and it was 24 hours before the cops found him in the woods with no clothes on. But we're getting by, right? And I bring that example up, and it's kind of stark, right? I bring that up because these families, they're out there and you don't see them, right? These are not families that go to church. These are not families that go to the movies. You don't see them at Publix very much. It's a big deal to leave the house. That family, I remember when they started, they said they hadn't been on a vacation since their son had been born. And actually that was the big thing, was at the end of the intervention, things had been very successful, and they went on a cruise. And it was like the life-changing thing for them to take a vacation and be able to go somewhere as a family. And it had changed so many factors for them. And, I get the opportunity to kind of travel around and talk to people all over the place. And, you hear these kinds of example stories where people people say, well, I was in France and they said, well, we don't have those kids. That's an American problem, right? That's because of your system and you don't. And I said, I actually know that those kids exist here because I was at one of your institutions. You just lock them up. That's the difference, right? You don't see those kids because you take them out of the home and lock them up. And so this is something that is very prevalent. These kinds of issues affect families in really significant ways. Not every family is in that situation. Clearly, that's a pretty stark example. But I raise that just to say, that is a possibility and it exists a lot. And these are some of the kids and families that we work with really hard to try to address issues. And when it comes to trying to solve some of these problems, psychopharmacology is the kind of easy solution these days, right? And, if you can give a pill for that, that's simple. I will tell you, most of the kids that we see there are very few examples. And we actually have a good group of psychiatrists at our center, really good people, care a ton, and really take care of their patients the best way they can. And when you catch them in a moment of honesty, what they tell you is, yeah, we really have like 7 things in our arsenal and like they all kind of can help a little bit. But for these kinds of families, they don't really change the game. They tend to be helping on the edges. There are very few instances where it's like game changing from 0 to 60 or 60. I don't know which direction those need to go necessarily, but it can be helpful. And it's certainly when it's because it's more straightforward, it's obviously the first place to start for a lot of kids and families, because if it can make a difference, if you can address that through a simpler means, that's the way to go. When it comes to how we think about these kinds of behaviors in particular, though, the number one thing, and again, for those of you who may be working with these kids and families, is to think about this type of behavior in using terms we would call functionally, right? We think about this type of behavior in terms of the purpose that the behavior serves for that individual. Knowing what you know now about autism and thinking about, well, what could the purpose of something like aggression or self-injury be? Well, the purpose of aggression, if I'm a kid who cares a ton about 3 things in the whole world, or maybe just one, and I can't really express that to other people, and I don't really see you much as a person, as the person who's preventing me from accessing that thing, or the one way that I do go about accessing that thing, you can see how in that situation, that combination of factors can pretty quickly turn into something like aggression, right? Like that becomes essentially a form of communication. We see a lot of kids who may engage in aggression or self-injury or other type of behavior. And really with some assessment, we figure out, well, what he's really saying is, Mom, if you don't mind, I would love it if I could have my iPad right now. The problem is he just doesn't have any words. So the aggression becomes the way of saying that, right? And so when we think about function, there's 2 key distinctions. There's what we would call socially mediated behavior and automatically maintained behavior. Socially mediated behavior is where in the chain of events that lead to that thing or that access to that consequence that's the purpose for that child, someone else is in the link, a link in the chain, right? So a cookie is a social consequence if it's on the top shelf and I need Mom to get it for me, right? The fact that Mom is the conduit is what makes that a social behavior, right? It's an aggression in that case would be a social behavior. Contrast that with automatically maintained behavior, which is behavior that there is no one else in that link, right? There's no one else in that chain. The behavior just automatically produces that consequence. I had a kid not too long ago who would poke at his eye. He'd actually had to have his eye reinserted a couple of times, which was not a thing that I knew you could do, but yeah, you can reinsert eyes apparently. He would poke at his eye and we figured out that the reason he was doing that, and I don't recommend you do this, but if you push on your eyeball and you can cause the photoreceptors in your retina to fire because of a buildup of pressure, where usually it's light that hits those and makes it. So he would see like little blobby flashing lights. And for that kid, that was kind of the coolest thing in his world. And so he could just automatically make that happen anytime he wanted by poking at his eye. He's doing great. We were able to address that. He's doing well. But, that is very different in terms of how you go about addressing that from a behavior that is an inherently social behavior. I'm running out of time right now. I'm not going to be able to get through everything here today. And I knew that was going to be the case when I started. Whoops. I just skipped way to the end. Let's see. Way to the end. I did want to just hit a couple of really quick, just some summary slides at the end that just with some take-home points.
Just a quick question while you're getting.
Sure.
All of your examples seem to have referenced males. Can you speak to a prevalence difference between males and females?
Yeah, so male to female is about 4 to 1, right? 4 males for every female on the spectrum. Now, I will say that's a statistic that goes back quite a ways. And I think there's a lot of questions that folks have asked about, are there differences in how autism shows up? And that perhaps there are more females than are being counted because females who are on the autism spectrum, it manifests slightly differently. And so there are a lot of questions about whether or not that's the case. There's questions about kind of what they call masking for girls who are on the spectrum. And so I think that's an area where there's a lot of work still to be done. And folks are just increasingly starting to see that may be the case. needs. But for now, we kind of stick with that roughly 4-to-1 ratio. So I think the overall take-home points again here, the biggest thing is autism is heterogeneous. You're going to hear lots of examples today, and I think the biggest point is just how much variability there is, which means that when those of us who are trying to support individuals on the spectrum or their families, have to be a little bit creative and be able to listen and watch and observe and see how the needs of that individual might look really different from another child or another individual on the spectrum, and how we support them probably needs to be tailored to what that individual need, what their preferences are, what they care about, what they like, and what they might need to be successful as they can be and optimize outcomes for them. So that just is that adaptability and that patience. But at the end of the day, that ecosystem idea of it's an entire community in order to meet these needs. It's not just a clinician. It's not just a physician. It's not just the schools. It's really everybody working in concert to try to address those needs. I know I'm over time, so I'm going to stop there, but I really appreciate everybody coming. The interest is really inspiring, and knowing that there are so many needs, and we are eager to partner and work with each of you to try to figure out how we can do better every day for the kids and families of Georgia. Thank you.